Hello and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I am going to be the host for today's event, and it's going to be a thrilling event. And today we will be discussing, well, okay, I'll just go ahead and drop the phrase and we'll talk about it a little bit later. We will be discussing the Lion of Whitehall. We will be discussing the legendary Kentuckian, the second most famous Cassius Clay in the history of Kentucky. We may even talk about the other one. But yes, we're going to talk about Cassius Marcellus Clay. And the book we are featuring is Anne E. Marshall's book, Cassius Marcellus Clay, The Life of an Anti-Slavery Slaveholder and the Paradox of American Reform. It comes to us from University of North Carolina Press. We thank UNC Press for publishing the book and helping us set up this event. And it has 303 pages. It's illustrated. The cost is $39.95. The author for today's book is Anne E. Marshall. Anne is an associate professor and the executive director of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi. I'm right about that, right? Starkville? Okay, good.
Yes.
Is the pronunciation right? Starkville.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, good,
We
good.
like we like to call it Stark Vegas sometimes, but Starkville will do.
Starkville, yeah. She is the author of Creating a Confederate Kentucky, and she has previously been featured on this program, A House Divided at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, where she discussed that book, Creating a Confederate Kentucky. And welcome back to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure, sure. It was a pleasure to see you last time, and it's great to see you here again with this new book. Now, your first book was Creating a Confederate Kentucky, and in that book, you referenced. I'm going to have to paraphrase this here because I didn't write it down, but you referenced the Southern historian Avery Craven, who was said said to have said that Kentucky was the only state that seceded after the Civil War was over. Uh, and that alone makes the subject of Kentucky and the Civil War fascinating. So,
Yeah.
for your second choice, you have also chosen a classic Kentuckian, Cassius Marcellus Clay. Tell me, what about the history of Kentucky leads you to want to keep asking questions about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm a native Kentuckian. And so, I sort of grew up surrounded by Civil War history and Civil War mythology. And that's what led me to write the first book. And then in the course of writing that book, I, of course, came across Cassius Marcellus Clay. He's also relatively easy to find in Kentucky. People invoke him quite a bit. And I sort of kept bumping into him when I was writing the first book. And so when I was finished with that, I decided to write about Cassius because he's an interesting figure. But as I was reading about him, in researching the first book, I started to realize that people were interested in him for what I thought were the wrong reasons. And so I decided to write about why they should be interested in him for the right reasons. So
Well, I'm happy to hear that. Although uh, I'm certainly one of the people who is fascinated with Cassius Marcellus Clay for the wrong reasons. Um, but hey, let's take a better look at that dust jacket because just like this other Cassius Clay from Kentucky, this guy was known for being a large, athletic, handsome fellow, legendary for his prowess in personal combat. Uh, so him and the other Cassius Clay seem to have a few things in common.
they,
So it seems to me easy that this guy we're looking at here in the dust jacket could create legends,
yes.
and that people could be drawn to those legends more than the story of his life.
Yes, I think so. And he helped to perpetuate some of those legends as well. So that was
He
part of
likes
it.
the legendary version of himself.
Did. Although, I mean, it was interesting. He would correct, I think he would be somewhat dismayed at some of the misinformation about him that's out there. But yes, he definitely, like Muhammad Ali, as I say in the book, they both thought they were the greatest. So they have that in common as well.
Yeah.
They're pugilistic and, maybe megalomaniacs as well.
Quite possibly. And yeah, we might talk about a little bit about Muhammad Ali later because you do include much in this book
Yeah.
about where you dig into the legends. And so we get outside of the story of the real guy and try to explain how the legends come around. And we might get to that a little later in the interview. That's part of the end of the book. But let's start by assuming that this is the first time that some of our folks have heard of this person, Cassius Marcellus Clay. And we're definitely not talking about Muhammad Ali. So, who is he? Who give us the elevator pitch here?
Yes. So Cassius Clay was born in Kentucky in 1810 into a wealthy slaveholding family, and he ended up inheriting quite a few enslaved laborers from his father when his father passed away. Cassius was only 18. But he went off to college to Yale. And while he was in Connecticut, he sort of became enamored with this northern industrial economy and the sort of free labor system there. And he really realized that slavery was holding back the economies of slave states like the one he came from, like Kentucky. And so when he came back and eventually entered politics, he didn't do this right away, but he slowly developed this economic critique of slavery. And he began to speak out against it more vociferously, which didn't really go over all that well in Kentucky, even though people in Kentucky entertained anti-slavery ideas more so than in states further south. But he eventually went on to, he was a local politician, but he eventually entered the national conversation about slavery. And eventually in the 1850s, becomes a founder of the Republican Party. He ends up being Lincoln's ambassador to Russia during the Civil War and to 1869. And within that, the reason that I think he's really famous is that because he was speaking out against slavery in a slave state, he ended up being physically assaulted several times. Some of this is, his own. He got into some duels of his own volition, but he ends up using a Bowie knife to defend himself as he's out in these political meetings. And of course, a Bowie knife was a very specific kind of weapon back in the
Yeah,
19th century. Had kind of, it was a weapon of the frontier. It wasn't a gentleman's weapon, even though Clay
right.
was himself a gentleman. So this kind of launches this really interesting national conversation about him because he's sometimes seen as a victim. He's sometimes seen, especially by more moralistic, anti-slave abolitionists in the North. He's seen as a brute, you know.
Yeah, like a
So nobody can kind of decide whether they really like him because he gives them hope that there might be a toehold to be had for anti-slavery in a slave state.
mhm,
Um, and then other people just think he's terrible. He also does things like he founds an anti-slavery newspaper in
mhm,
Lexington, and sets up his newspaper office with two 4-pounder cannons to scare off anybody that would attack the newspaper office. So
mhm.
it's this very interesting character because he is a very sort of hyper masculine, anti-slavery spokesman. that, is he's just unusual because he doesn't really fit the mold of the sort
Right.
of moral abolitionist, and he's not, but he's very much a law and order. He wants slavery to end very constitutionally,
Right.
like most Republicans did. And so, what I argue in the book is that rather being this kind of, he's been seen as this kind of one-off character. Um, Interesting to people because of his use of weapons and his very volatile character.
Mhm.
Historians have oftentimes seen him though as a one-off character. It's this sort of like really unique figure from the South. But what I argue in the book is if you look at his anti-slavery rationale, why he was against slavery, why he want and how he wanted it to end, which was gradually and constitutionally,
Mhm.
he's really a mainstream Republican. And
Yeah.
so that though kind of gets lost because
Well,
people start to in the late 19th and the early 20th century start to see him as an abolitionist, which he would have a label he would have completely
right.
denied and did deny during his lifetime.
Mhm.
The mainstream anti-slavery spokespeople did not want to be considered an abolitionist because those were radicals, right? And
Right.
so it's a little bit, it's about the book's about him, but it's also about how we've kind of confused different brands of anti-slavery and why that kind of, that obscures some really important facts about anti-slavery and
Right.
kind of if we don't understand that, then we don't really understand why the Civil War ends slavery, but doesn't really usher in lasting equality for African Americans.
Right. Right. And I think I think you chose the right word, paradox, in your subtitle. That every time you think you've got this guy, he also seems to be the other side of the coin at the same time.
Yeah, yeah,
He's a interesting and vital personal, even violent personal personality, while also having a more conservative political view than we would like him to have. He's not John Brown.
right, right.
Now let's go back chronologically here, and I want to ask: Did you what role did his experience at Yale have in this growing anti-slavery ideology of his? You've already mentioned that he saw the way that New England ran and noticed that this was a thriving economy as opposed to what he perceived in the South. But how did he pick up this sort of uh, anti-slavery heat, in his rhetoric?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. So yeah, he definitely imbibed this kind of the free labor and ideology when he was in the North, and he also saw how industry dovetailed nicely with subsistence farming in the North as well. And so, there was this intellectual part of it. He also saw William Lloyd Garrison give a speech, and he writes about this incident in his autobiography. And I think that's where, people always bring this part up and they sort of say, well, this is when he becomes an abolitionist. Well, not really. He never really agrees with Garrison's approach. But I think that kind of moral fervor that Garrison had did kind of, as Clay said, really had an impact on him because he didn't know up until then that you could speak out with that much fervor against, something that he had taken for granted growing up in a slaveholding household. And so I think that plays into it as well. He also some of it's just his personality. He
Mhm.
was just, did everything with fervor. So that was part of it as well. But it does take him a while between Yale and the time I mean, he gets into politics before he really starts to fully develop this critique of slavery. So it was kind of a slow rollout. But yeah, I think that's definitely the roots of it.
Yeah, yeah. Now he's being from this sort of, there's a lot of romance simply to the place he's from. He's from Lexington. And so he's there with other Clays. He's obviously has some sort of relationship that I hope you'll tell us about with the great compromiser.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then also visited, certainly knew the Todds of Lexington. Now, if you look over my shoulder, I want the folks at home to know that because we're at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, we get to talk about all sorts of actual artifacts of history as well as the book that we're selling. And let's take a look at what I've got close up of what I have over my shoulder here. It really is one of the nicest busts you can get, one of the most best artistic looks at the First Lady. This is Mary Todd Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln, and she's portrayed here as First Lady. But so, I mean, as a child, when Mary was a child, and when Cassius was a child and a young man, did he interact with the Todd family? Do you have any evidence of him being part of that Lexington culture?
Yeah, so and he actually grew up a little bit south to one county south of Lexington in
Mhm.
Madison County, but they would have been in close proximity, and certainly Green Clay, who was Cassius's father, and would have known Robert Todd, and they have politically they were both Whigs, and so they would have definitely come into contact with each other. I don't have a lot of direct correspondence. In fact, there's not a lot of Cassius correspondence prior to 1864. His in 1864, Confederate troops, probably under the leadership of John Hunt Morgan's cavalry, came through and burned the outbuilding at Whitehall, which was Cassius's estate. So all of his correspondence, almost all of it, that he would have collected, has burned down with that. That's where he kept it. So. But it's I mean highly likely, and certainly the families, we do have evidence of them interacting. So
Yeah. I hadn't even thought of bringing John Hunt Morgan into the conversation, but obviously, yeah, he was there too.
yeah.
He
Yes,
probably
I know. Really,
knew
that's
at least knew Clay by reputation.
yes, yes.
And then just very quickly, uh, what would it be Cassius's relationship with Henry Clay?
That's a great question. So that's something that people have not been able, even these really, great genealogists have
Mhm.
not been able to quite tease out. We
Mhm.
think they're second cousins, maybe second cousins once removed.
Mhm.
One of the difficulties here is that there were a huge number of Clays that come over from Virginia to Kentucky right around the time of the Revolution and right afterwards. And so trying to sort of suss out, all these different strands, these branches of the clay trees is very difficult. And so really we don't have a definitive, and even they didn't know how they were related to each
Right.
other. Cassius did, though, interestingly, when Cassius got basically he was tried for mayhem after he maimed a man with his Bowie knife
Yeah.
in 1843. And so Henry Clay happened to be on hiatus from Washington at the time, and volunteered to defend Clay. He got Cassius off, basically had him acquitted. And then Cassius was asked to go and stump for his cousin
Mhm.
during the election of 1844. And as I talk about in the book, Henry Clay later came to regret that decision because it's quite possible that Cassius lost the election for Henry Clay in
Okay.
1844. So it's so yeah, they were related somehow, but
Yeah. But that's and that brings us to this probably the most interesting brawl that Cassius was in. And I think maybe we could just let people read the book to learn about this affair at Russell's Cave. But it's certainly the centerpiece of the legend
Mhm.
of Cassius Marcellus Clay. And so, without, you've already mentioned the knife fight before, so without having to go into the actual fighting, which is very entertainingly described in your book, and also at odds with the legend, if you've gotten that from elsewhere, what, give us more about the how the fight at Russell's Cave created not the post life legend of Clay, but the image, the brand of Cassius Marcellus Clay in his life.
So this was this fight that happened in 1843, and he was basically targeted by a hired assassin. The Wycliffe family was a very prominent Kentucky family, and they were political opponents of Cassius Clay. And so they hired this guy who'd beaten up a number of other people, and so Cassius ably defends himself and ends up gouging out this guy's eye, cutting off an ear. I mean, it was bloody, bloody, bloody. And so I think, Cassius does this. I mean, and again, when he's fighting, and this is another reason, we can kind of see him as a not John Brown, is that he only fights in self-defense. Now, he puts himself in situations, where it's pretty likely that he's going to be attacked, but he doesn't go out on the attack, you know, just, for the sake of that. And so I think though, because he's working with such a very kind of a weapon that's seen as so barbaric, part of that is just that he's trying to send the message, don't mess with me, and he kind of has to because, both from a position of he's got to stay alive. So it's a matter of survival, but it's also a matter, I think, of political survival as well. Kentucky is still in this very sort of Western Southern honored based culture where if you show cowardice, you lose people's respect. And so, ironically, being, going around talking about, being against slavery with a knife in your hand is going to get you a little more respect than you would have if you were doing so without a weapon.
Yeah. Well, yeah, one of the things that you notice is this sort of leads that I guess my question was sort of leading here. But one of the things you notice is that by the time Charles Olmsted travels through Kentucky, he knows who Clay is well. And so he sort of gets a third person's view of what the Kentuckians think of their neighbor.
Yeah, yeah. And and that's, I think that was in
Frederick
1855
Law Olmsted. Sorry
when
about
he
that.
came through.
Mhm.
And he noticed, and this was after Clay, after the newspaper, the True American is what
Yeah.
Cassius Clay's newspaper was called. It does get shut down in Kentucky within 3 months of publication, actually even less than that, fewer than 3 months, and then goes to starts he's Clay starts publishing it out of Cincinnati after that for about a year and a half. But Clay ends up joining the army and going to fight in Mexico, which is a political fight that he really diminished and basically said Polk is just trying to extend slavery, and so he really criticized it, but he ends up going to fight anyway, which again seems extremely hypocritical.
Mhm.
And it was, but for him, it was a matter of survival because it was an extremely popular war in Kentucky. And he knew if he wanted to stay and live in Kentucky, and he needed to do that. I talk about that in the book as well. He couldn't just pick up and move. That in order to, survive, and do business with people in Kentucky, that he would have to, he would have to prove his manhood and prove himself a patriot. And so he goes off to Mexico, which, It's an interesting move, but
Yeah.
and it worked though. It worked. He gained a lot of respect. And
Mm.
so he was pretty smart about people did respect him as much as they disliked his ideas, they respected him as a man. And I think
Yeah.
that was very important to him.
Yeah. And certainly the lots of very interesting stories happened to him in Mexico when he was there. And it's a reason to read the autobiography as well as your biography. But we're going to move on into American politics because we're halfway through our discussion already. That's how time flies when we're having fun. Um, Now, I want to talk about the 1860 election a little bit
Mhm.
here, but first, I am going to let one of our viewers give you a question. I'm going to check in with what we have, and we have a viewer that has a question about the 1864 election. So we're going to leap ahead in time a little bit here. But Jeffrey Boutwell is watching, and Jeffrey asks, was Clay a possible alternative to Andrew Johnson as VP in the 1864 running with Lincoln? Would Clay as president instead of Johnson made much of a difference in the early years of Reconstruction?
Well, hi, Jeffrey. I know Jeffrey, so I appreciate this
So do I. Hi,
question.
Jeffrey.
Yes. Actually, so Clay in 1864 thought he was a viable alternative to Abraham Lincoln. He actually because of course Lincoln was so unpopular
Yeah.
before that election, and Clay was very much, it was very. Um, very much wanted to be politically successful in a way that he never was. I don't think he was a viable substitute. By the time that they get close to the election, he had returned to Russia to. I explain in the book, but he didn't like Russia at first, so he came back and then begged Lincoln to send him back to Russia. So Lincoln does. But yeah, I don't think he would have been a very viable candidate because he was such a mainstream Republican. Whereas, of course, we know Johnson was added to the ticket to pick up Democratic votes. Clay would not have done that. He was a sort of conservative, anti-slavery, spokesperson, but he definitely wasn't the type of person who would have appealed to the Northern Democratic voters that they were hoping that that Johnson would appeal to.
Yeah, yeah. And I often think this is I'm just digressing from the book a little bit, but into the 1864 election. I think sometimes students of history misunderstand just how important the branding of the Union ticket was in 1864, the Union Party.
Mhm.
Given what we know, how everything worked out, we kind of default back to calling them Republicans. But
Yeah,
they
yeah.
were definitely rebranding themselves even under a different party name, the Union Party in 1864.
Right,
A-
right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, so as you say, the presence of Lincoln and Clay on that ticket would have made it a strictly Republican, Northern and Republican and Unionist ticket. Um, but I want to talk about the 1860 election because there's
Mhm.
something about this goes back to your interest in Kentucky. There's something about Kentucky that I think made the Republican candidate in 1860 particularly attractive to people. And here at the bookshop, we have a couple more artifacts. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of patriotic covers or envelopes, if you will, that were created for the 1860 election. And here we have a different Kentucky politician who wields a maul instead of a Bowie knife, and splits rails instead of skulls. And this is an image that they want to project, that the Republicans want to project about their candidate. And so it seems to me that the Republicans see their candidate. There's another example of a patriotic cover, and I'm going to show everybody exactly what we're talking about here. It's an envelope, it's a small one too, and But there's something about that branding because you see it all the time. Something about Kentucky is very influential in national politics in 1860. So much so that even though the Republicans candidate is from Illinois, they make sure he knows. They make sure that people know he's from Kentucky.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I think it's that that sort of hearty Western kind of, of image that, and it's really interesting, that they're picturing, I think on that postcard, Lincoln is the sort of pictured as the quintessential yeoman farmer. Well, of course, we know that Abraham Lincoln's father, they pick up and move first to Indiana, then later to Illinois. And part of that is because they don't, it's better. They have better opportunities
Hmm.
in the Midwest outside of a slave state. And this is actually goes like really dovetails nicely with Cassius's argument. He says people are leaving Kentucky to go to these new states that are opening up, and we're losing population, we're losing relevance because they're losing congressional representation as all of these new states are new territories are becoming states. And so his argument is, if we want to stay relevant as a state and prosperous and educated, if we want to be, invest
Hmm.
in public education, the slave economy and also the sort of political organization of the sort of slave owning oligarchy works against all of that. So it dovetails in an interesting way with Lincoln's story in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the environment of Lincoln working in it is attractive, but also the picture of Lincoln working alone by himself as a hardy frontiersman, yeoman farmer. You don't need to juxtapose that with pictures of slavery to show that this is what Americans would prefer.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned before, and I'm going to stick around these 1850s and 1860s for 1860 for the next question, because you had mentioned very early in your introduction that Cassius Marcellus Clay is not a one-off. He's a type, and it might be a scarce. There might not be many of his type, but it's a type.
Mhm.
And one example that you bring into the book is a Southern anti-slavery author who is easily as famous in his time as Cassius Marcellus Clay was, and that is Hinton Rowan Helper, the
Yeah.
famous publisher of writer of Southern anti-slavery books and points of view. And as if I recall correctly, it's Helper's books that are leading the slaveholding uh, senators to try to censor the mail and try to keep
Mhm.
Northerners from mailing copies of Hinton Rowan Helper's book to the South. So, so there's a connection here, at least ideologically, between Clay and Helper, and the arguments that they're making for a white anti-slavery argument.
Yes, yes. And so Helper's book, I think, comes out in 1857, I want to say. And Clay, he really uses the same line of argument that Clay does. And one of the things that Clay does, I think I mentioned at the beginning that, people, tend to focus on what I say the sort of wrong, like Henry Clay, I mean, like Cassius Clay, are interested in him for sort of the wrong reasons. And I mean, maybe there's no wrong reason to be interested in him, but one of the things that gets overlooked a lot is that he was really on the sort of an early adopter of using what we would call today data. They would just call it statistics back then, probably. But he used the U.S. Census to build this argument about the number of laborers, the productivity, and then he would compare Kentucky to northern states. Most often, he would use Ohio as kind of a foil. to Kentucky. Yeah, so he would use these numbers to sort of argue about like the relative prosperity or lack thereof in Kentucky, the population, the crop yields, these very sort of what we would call boring measures, which I think is
Mhm.
really interesting because he's such an interesting guy, but nobody's interested in his statistics, right?
Yeah.
But that's really where, he lays the groundwork for Helper, who comes in. Clay was doing this in the early 1840s. Helper writes his book, and Helper is his book is huge. It's I don't know how many pages, but it's giant. And so he uses more statistics for more states, and he's actually more fiery in his language. I mean, Helper
Mhm.
tells white Southerners, non-slave holding Southerners that slaveholders owe them, and he tells them that they owe them a specific. He's really intent on building grievances
Yeah.
in a way that Clay really isn't. Clay is actually really more of a law and order person, despite the Bowie knife. It's interesting. But yes, they're connected. And Clay really helped to promote Helper's book when it came out. So
Mhm. And getting to know Helper a little bit is that, well, there's a biography of Helper that I believe even the title describes him as anti-slavery racist,
yeah,
because the Helper argument is certainly grounded in white supremacy and
yes.
how the institution of slavery is injurious to poor whites without much uh, humanitarian feeling toward the enslaved people.
Yes, that is definitely true. And I mean, Clay himself was always said, my interest is that of the white man. I want to create more opportunities for the white man. He wasn't nearly as viscerally racist as Helper,
Mhm.
but he certainly was. I mean, we can look back at his writings and see that he was definitely racist, even though he definitely felt like African Americans had the capacity for freedom, which is more than a lot of white Americans thought, and even that they could become good citizens and voters one day. I mean, he believed that back in the 1840s, 1850s, when a lot of people would not have said that. At the same time, though, he was definitely racist in his thinking, as were many, 19th century white Americans.
Right. And Clay would make, I'm going to go ahead and show one more thing here. Oh, I didn't make a picture, but over my shoulder here is an Emancipation Proclamation. And you use an Emancipation Proclamation as an illustration in the book. And this one is by Dimmick and Alvord. But one of the things you write about Clay is that he would write and say things that had uh, personally humane feelings toward African American people and enslaved people. Yet he kept the people that he enslaved in bondage long after they might have become free if he'd made another choice.
Yes, that's absolutely true. He ends up manumitting some of his enslaved laborers in right before he starts his newspaper
Mhm.
in 1844, 1845. But he continues to hold enslaved people until the end of the Civil War, because of course the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Kentucky since it was a loyal border state. And so he's off in Russia, but his wife, Mary Jane, is back in Kentucky, completely reliant on enslaved labor. Now, several of their enslaved laborers did go and enlist in the Union Army in 1864. So some of them did, free themselves with the help of the Union Army. But yeah, it's I think that's another irony, right? Like he's in Washington when the Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and he and
Right.
Salmon Chase celebrate this, but meanwhile, he's got all of these enslaved laborers working for him back in Kentucky. So, and would
Mhm.
have for another couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. A paradox.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we've mentioned his trip, his role in Russia a couple of times. Let's get into that a little bit. Now, he has such a long post-war career that we don't have much time to talk about Russia, but boy, he had some adventures there. Um,
He did. Yeah, he got into some trouble with there was a scandal involving a brothel owner and his relations with her. And then a couple of years after he comes back, a Russian orphan arrives on his doorstep that is probably his son, and he
yeah.
adopts him and raises him as his son. So yes, he kind of led a bachelor lifestyle over in Russia.
But on
So
the other
yeah,
side,
that's all in the book too.
yeah, that's
So,
all in the book. And so, yeah, we're not going to get deep into it, just enough to let you know you need to buy the book in order
right.
to read some
It's
of
got
these really
everything.
cool
It's got
stories.
Bowie knives and sex. Like, what
Bowie
else do you want
knives,
in the book?
sex, yeah, yeah, Russian
Right.
brothels. But uh, but I'm going to ask. But I do want you to get your observation in looking at all of the time he spent in the court of the Tsar. Could you point to any particular diplomatic credit uh, that that might have led to decisions that the Russians made regarding the Civil War? On on the side of his diplomatic portfolio, did he was he a competent diplomat?
Yeah, I mean, peers at the time did not find him to be incredibly competent. Russia really, of course, France and England were the nations that America was most dependent on in terms of support and most wanted to prevent from siding with the Confederacy. Russia, not so much. And there's definitely some correspondence between William Seward and Cassius Clay on that front. But really, he doesn't do a whole lot diplomatically that is what we would consider to be high stakes. And in fact, probably the most important thing, definitely the most important thing that happened in U.S. relations with Russia during Clay's tenure was, of course, the purchase of Alaska, which
Yeah.
Clay was not involved in at all. In fact, we have court, and he would later say that he was and that he was responsible for this. And he even said that he wanted one word on his tombstone, and that was the word Alaska. But you can look in the papers of the Foreign Relations of the United States and see Clay's letter to Seward expressing complete and utter surprise at the purchase of Alaska. He had no idea what was going on. So,
Yeah.
I think they kind of he wasn't a very he really actually wasn't. I mean, people called him an undiplomatic diplomatist. So,
Uh-huh.
he wasn't particularly diplomatic. And so, honestly, Lincoln sent him to Russia because he said he could do the least harm there. So I lay all that out in the book too. He didn't have the best relationship with Lincoln. So,
Yeah. Hey, one thing that thing that I'm not going to get to share with you, as far as an artifact, is an artifact, a Lincoln endorsement that we recently had, that's found a home, uh, but it's in it's not like we've lost it. The material's in the historical record, but it's Lincoln endorsing a request by Simon Cameron to return.
oh
And saying,
yes, yes,
it's not really an endorsement. It's a letter to Seward saying it's time to let the guy come back. Something to
right,
that
yeah.
extent. It was really nice. It was fun to have it. I would have liked to share it, but unfortunately, this is what we do here. Um, and but that's the so this story of Clay and Russia and Cameron and Russia is a fascinating diplomatic story, and it's in the book, and I highly recommend that folks buy it and read it and pay attention to that. But it does bring us to the man's long post-war career, a whole other life. And it's hard to hit every high point or every low point, as the case may be. But just once he gets back to Kentucky after all of this stuff that he's done, and now the war is over, how would you describe his post-war life in Kentucky? What was his position in his community amongst the people that knew him?
Yeah, so he sort of went back to farming. He ended up getting he and his wife divorced,
Mhm.
because largely because of all the scandals.
Yep.
But so he was kind of by himself on his farm in Madison County. But he was very involved in, in political matters, and he wrote a lot. And he really, one of the things that happens while he's in Russia is he starts speaking out against Reconstruction policy. And he doesn't like, he's all for the 14th and 15th Amendment, citizenship and voting rights,
Mhm.
but he hates how the federal government is enforcing that. And he thinks that that is infringing on the rights of white Southerners to, that they've lost citizenship rights and voting rights, and also that it's really, antithetical to the right relationship between states and the federal government. So it's interesting because he had to vary states' rights. He really wanted slavery to end within individual states. He thought
Mhm.
that was the way to do it. And after the war, he keeps that same thinking, carries it into Reconstruction, and he's just one of many of these anti-slavery stalwarts that turn against Reconstruction. And I think that's something, that to me is really where Clay is an important, beyond an individual at a level. He really can tell us a lot about the mainstream anti-slavery movement. He becomes a liberal Republican, which is, of course, is the breakaway faction that runs Horace Greeley, running against Ulysses Grant in the 1872 election. And they really are upset about Reconstruction, and so they turn against the federal efforts to enforce these Reconstruction measures, which I think again is another paradox, right? We would think that people who were for Black freedom before the war
Mhm.
would support what was necessary to protect Black freedom after the war. But that is not what happens. And eventually, that's what erodes the support for Reconstruction on a national level in the 1870s.
Yeah, and certainly the term liberal Republican in 1872 does does not have any synonym with what we would call a progressive wing or a civil rights wing of the party. It's quite the opposite. It's liberal meant something else to those folks, right?
Right. It's sort of a classical liberalism, we
Mhm.
would think about it
Yeah.
as being, yeah.
Uh, Well, then we only have a few minutes left, but we're getting to this entire other Cassius Marcellus Clay, the one that seems to be born on the day he dies. And that is the legend and the memory of Cassius Marcellus Clay. And I think this must have been fun for you because so much of your first book was also about the memory of the Civil War, much of it false in Kentucky
Right.
after the war. And so Cassius Marcellus Clay fits that almost to a T in that as soon as he dies, there's this legend that's created about him. So if somebody's new to this topic in this conversation, what what happens with the actual man and his legend? How does he become this mythical figure?
Yeah, yeah. So people, forget about him a little bit, but then they start remembering his, the more sensational, portions of his career, the knife fights. I forgot to mention that when he is 84 years old, he marries a 15-year-old girl. So they remember that. There's all kinds of reasons that they remember him, but they forget why he was anti-slavery, and they start calling him an abolitionist. And in fact, this is really kind of a part of a larger sort of collapsing of differences or understanding of differences in the anti-slavery movement that happens for really for the whole movement in the 20th century. People forget that there's that most people were not anti-slavery for moral reasons. They did not want the immediate end of slavery. So all anti-slavery starts to be sort of cast as abolitionist. And so that's what happens to Clay. And then, of course, this ratchets up with the emergence of the boxer, Cassius Clay, who becomes Muhammad Ali. And so this kind of gives I would say, a whole third life to Cassius Marcellus Clay when Muhammad Ali arrives on the scene, and so people start to draw on Clay's career and comparisons then.
Mhm. And certainly, this is where I wish to fly the flag for Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, because that plays a role in sort of this myth making, this legendary myth making. Here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop is where Carl Sandburg and Ralph Newman and all of the others founded the Civil War Round Table, which is that now there are Civil War roundtables all around the world. So the original one was here in this shop in Chicago. And on the 17th of October, 1952, the Civil War Roundtable invited a fascinating attorney, old attorney from the bluegrass of Kentucky, named William Townsend, to come to Chicago and give a speech called "The Lion of Whitehall." They recorded the speech. They printed vinyl LPs. They sold them. We still have CDs of The Lion of Whitehall. Nobody has a CD player anymore, but we still have some of the CDs. You can hear the speech. Okay, so let's just in the last few minutes, let's bring Bill Townsend into this discussion. Who is this bourbon drinking attorney from the bluegrass that goes around the world uh, doing speeches about the Lion of Whitehall?
Yeah, so William Townsend was a attorney, and clearly had honed his skills in front of hundreds of Central Kentucky juries over his
Mhm.
life. He could spin a yarn. He also loved Abraham Lincoln. He wrote a lot of, and I know you know this. He wrote a
Yep.
lot of books about Abraham Lincoln, and especially Lincoln's link to Kentucky. And so that caused him to become interested in Cassius Clay. And so, yes, he goes to this Civil War Roundtable in 1850 or six, sorry, 1952,
Yep.
and he gives this hour. I think it's about an hour and a half long. Like the album is a double album.
Yes, it
It's a
is.
very long speech, but it's so entertaining. You can understand if you listen to it, and I think you can. I mean, I should encourage people to buy your CDs, but you can also find an electronic copy. I think on the Chicago Civil War Roundtable
Mhm.
website, they have a sort of library of them. But yeah, so he gives this amazing talk. He brings some Bowie knives for show and tell. He
Mhm.
launches into all these fights, into all of Clay's, relations and relationships with women. And it is highly entertaining, but highly embellished. So,
Mhm.
I don't have any hope of competing with William Townsend in terms of my, entertainment, nor am I able to illustrate physically Cassius Clay's knife wielding techniques, which
Mhm.
Townsend would also do. But I do have I think I have on my side that my book is factual. So, but this really took off because this was on vinyl, and
Mhm.
people we didn't have cable television back then. We didn't have the internet. So people would sit around and listen to these LPs. And it's amazing how many people listen to that LP because you can really, I mean, you can just trace the facts, I'll use air quotes, that Townsend mentioned. And then, this sort of information that is circulated in different places. And so, yes, the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop is heavily responsible for the mythological Cassius Marcellus Clay. So,
Okay, okay. Well, we'll buy that. We'll cop to that. But now we will also sell. the actual story of Cassius Marcellus Clay. And yeah, just to take us out, since we've set up these competing visions, um, let me know why you think, outside of the craft of history, of what we practice, why do you think the actual story of the man's life is more fascinating than the it was never a movie, but the sort of Hollywood adventure type of Cassius Marcellus Clay that that we had through the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the power of one man's story to answer a really uh, primary conundrum in American history, which is why we granted African American freedom and freedoms, with the Reconstruction amendments. But then why it took, why, for example, is there 100 years between, the 13th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, right? Why does it take almost a century to make sure that these rights that were also worked into the 14th and 15th Amendment? Why do we need the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? There's 100 years in there, right? What happened, right? And so I think that by tracing Clay's thinking and realizing that it was pretty mainstream, despite
Mhm.
all of the very unique aspects to his personality, that we can really see why this is. And even though, it might be, it might not be that I sometimes to use, shorthand that it shows us that people might be on the so-called right side of history, but not for the reasons that we would hope they would be.
Mhm.
And, my goal in this is not to tear Clay down. I actually think I'm giving him credit for a lot of things that historians generally don't give him credit for.
Mhm.
But it's to understand that, really how fragile this anti-slavery coalition was,
Mhm.
and the contingency that was involved with their success. It took a civil war, of course, and then what happens afterwards. And I don't think we get that after story very often when we look at either the politics of slavery or what happens at slavery's end. We don't really get a through line.
Mhm.
And I think Clay can really provide this interesting through line, especially when we realize that there are all of his anti-slavery compatriots that were major national figures. You've got your Horace Greeley's, your Salmon Chase, all of those people. So he wasn't alone in this. He was very representative. And so I think that's what makes him so important is that he can really help us understand this, again, the paradox of American reform.
Yeah. And yeah, I would add to that that it can be very almost difficult and confusing to explain anti-slavery politics versus abolitionist politics. And now you have to go read all of Eric Foner's books and things like that. But that explanation can come out of just looking at the life of one person that had to live through all of those ideologies. And Cassius Marcellus Clay seems to be one of those people.
Yeah, yeah. I think so, certainly. So
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Anne. Weeks. But for right now, let's take one more look at Cassius Marcellus Clay, The Life of an Anti-Slavery Slaveholder, and the Paradox of American Reform. Comes from University of North Carolina Press at Chapel Hill. The price is $39.95, and you can order it at the link. And thank you one more time for joining us.
thank you for having me.
And we'll see all the rest of you next time on A House Divided. Bye.